I don't go on many trips out of town, so this was one of the few times I've had to stay somewhere other than a friend or family's house. The area I needed to stay in was small, and most of the hotels didn't look very nice. But to my surprise, there was a single home listed on Airbnb. It was my first time using the site, but the house looked like a decent place, much better than the hotels. I requested the dates and in a few minutes the place was booked. The following week, I started the drive. When I got to the town, which was about 14 hours from my city, it was well into the night. The town almost looked deserted compared to where I was used to living. All the houses' lights were off, and all the stores were closed. No people or cars were out. Of course, it was the middle of the night, so I didn't expect this small town to be lit up and active at this time, but it was still eerie, considering I hadn't seen it during the day. I only came in with this as the first impression. The street that took me to the Airbnb was dark as well, leading through a winding forested neighborhood until I eventually ended up at the house. It was one of few that had its porch and outdoor lights on, but one window upstairs had a light coming through it as well. I figured the last customer had just made the mistake of leaving it on, so I thought nothing of it and started getting my stuff up to the front door. I got the key code from my email and opened the door, getting inside and locking the door behind me. I quickly put my stuff in the corner of the room, then went upstairs to turn off the light that was left on. It was one of the spare bedrooms, only having a bed and a small dresser in it. I flicked it off, then went to the main bedroom to set up my things. I was only staying for the one night, but I had it booked for 2 because I needed to be there late into the following day. I was up for no more than an hour before finally getting in bed and turning in for the night. I rested my eyes and tried to sleep, but was laying awake for a long time. I sat up quickly, hearing a thud run through the walls of the house. I stared at the door, trying to think what could have been the cause of the sound, but with no ideas coming to mind, I got up to check. I opened the door softly, peering into the upstairs hallway. It was dark and quiet now. No more thuds, only the sounds of the house swaying in the wind. I stepped back and quietly shut the door, but a strange feeling came to me that had me wait as I thought more about the sound I heard. As I stood there, soft creaks started to go along the floorboards from the other room. I listened with my ear against the door as the creaking moved into the hallway and then began making its way toward the door. I was so in shock that I almost didn't realize that it had to be footsteps of someone approaching. My heart started racing as they came right up to the other side of the door. I put my hand tightly on the door handle to keep it from moving, and only a moment later, I felt it pull down. As soon as I resisted it, they eased off. There was a small moment before suddenly the handle was forced down and they slammed into the door. It swung half open before I pressed my body back into it. I only saw half of their face in the doorway, but in their eyes was an anger that I didn't expect to ever see. After a struggle, I somehow managed to push the door back into the latch and lock it. The man on the other side tried to get it back open, but after yelling a few unpleasant words towards me, he ran downstairs and out of the house. I was still catching my breath and my mind was racing, but I gathered myself up and dialed 911. For such a small town, they came shortly after. The owner of the Airbnb continued with the case after I left on the following day, but I wish I had kept up with it. That man seemed so desperate to get into my room and was in some state of rage, like he wanted to hurt me as if I'd done something to him. Everything about it is disturbing, and I don't think I'll ever get it out of my head, but Airbnbs probably won't be something I take part in again for a long time. Me and a good friend of mine, Zach, were going together to a mutual friend's wedding in Wyoming. They chose to get married in the small town they grew up in, which was inconvenient for everyone else, but who am I to say? Zach and I found a nice Airbnb nearby and took his car across a few states to the middle of Wyoming. This town was mostly made up of farms, with a small central area for groceries, food, and some small businesses. On the outskirts, we found the Airbnb. It was a farmhouse as we'd expected, but it had so much land around it that we didn't expect. The home was almost entirely isolated from everywhere else. Looking off in any direction, the only things visible were grass, trees, and the dirt road leading here. We unloaded and unpacked our luggage inside. It was nice. I wouldn't compliment its looks too much, but it was great for a couple nights stay. Zach and I spent the rest of the day hanging out and talking, going to bed by 11. I took a while to fall asleep. I think it was because the house was so far out, it just made me feel kind of uneasy. Once I did fall asleep though, I slept pretty well. In the morning, we went to the wedding and spent the whole day there, not getting back to the Airbnb until at least 9 or 10. Zach went to bed right away, but I stayed in the living room to relax for a little bit. But it was only 10 minutes after settling in that a single quiet knock came from the front door. I got up, but was very uncomfortable with someone being here this late in the night. I walked over to the door and looked to see who it was, but when I checked, I didn't see anyone. I opened the door and stuck my head out, looking around. The driveway was empty, and as far as I could see, there was nobody outside. After a few moments, I shut the door. I looked over at Zach's room and knew he must have been passed out already, so he probably didn't hear it. I assumed it was just a noise from the house that resembled a knock. It was just one quiet sound as well, so everything started to point to it being nothing. I sat back down to continue resting, but not even a minute after sitting, a quiet noise knocked from the outside of the house. This time, though, it was from the other side of the house. I quickly got up and rushed over to the back, turning on the outdoor light and looking out the window. But again, there was nothing. This only furthered the idea that it was just the house making these noises, but it still didn't take away from the unsettling nature of it. I stayed by the window for a while, I don't know, maybe 5 minutes, looking out into the backyard that led to the forest, which was now pitch black. I was hoping that by seeing nothing out there, I'd be less on edge, but it actually only unsettled me further. There was just something about being out here in someone else's farmhouse that gave me an uncomfortable feeling. I stayed up for a while longer, waiting to be sure nothing else was going on, before I decided to try my hand at getting some sleep. I went to my room, which was across the hall from Zach's, and laid in bed. Hearing nothing else, I slowly drifted asleep. When I woke, my eyes shot open to someone knocking on my bedroom door. "Hello? Zach?" I called out. To my relief, I heard Zach's voice from the hall, asking me to come out for a second. I got up and met him in the hallway. From just one look at him, I knew something was wrong. He looked terrified and worried. "What's going on?" I asked. He explained that he woke up to something moving around outside his window, and when he moved the curtains, he saw the back of a man walking around the house. As we were discussing the situation, clicking sounds began coming from the front door. Both of us ran over to the living room. A man was on the porch, standing with his body against the door. He was clearly fidgeting with something, which immediately made me sure that he was trying to pick the lock. I turned and looked at Zach in fear, and I think he knew exactly what was going on without me having to say anything. He ran to his room and called the police, while I stayed and made sure that this guy outside didn't get in. The only thing I could really do was hold the lock and hope he couldn't disable it somehow. I could hear the man getting frustrated, and then all of a sudden, he ran off to the side of the house. Both of us were too scared to check the windows and opted instead for locking ourselves in one of the rooms and waiting for the cops to come. If I'm being honest, the rest of what happened was very uneventful. Cops pulled in a long while later, gathering very little evidence and never getting any leads on what happened that night. I don't know who that guy was or why he was trying to break into the Airbnb, but if those noises I heard earlier in the night were from him, then he had been stalking the house for several hours and knew that he was breaking into an occupied home, which only makes the whole encounter even more terrifying. I was staying at an Airbnb in a neighboring city. This was over 3 years ago now, and although it wasn't completely necessary for me to rent an Airbnb for the night, I had a potentially important job interview in the morning and preferred not to drive 3 hours at dawn and immediately follow up with an interview. I drove over at 4 and arrived around 7. The house was in a nice neighborhood and it looked like any normal city street with family-sized homes. I parked in the driveway and went inside, almost having my heart stop when a woman came around the corner and introduced herself. I was not expecting to see anyone in the house, so I had to collect myself before even responding. She said she was staying here for a few days in the other half of the house, and just thought to introduce herself to keep things from being awkward. I had no idea this was a shared rental, but I returned the favor and introduced myself as well, then went to my room. I took my phone out of my pocket and went to the Airbnb app to see if I'd made the mistake or if this was some kind of shady ripoff. Before I got the chance to really look though, the woman came up to my door and started talking to me again. She asked a lot about me and was just trying to keep the small talk going, which I tried to signal that I wasn't really interested in talking at the moment, but she didn't seem to notice. If I didn't know any better, I'd say she was flirting with me. It was a little weird considering I'd just arrived, and it was pretty late in the day, so I was obviously tired. After a couple minutes, she finally went away, and I had the chance to check the app. Nowhere on it did it mention multiple rooms for rent. It just said it was a house for rent. However, the pictures did only show a single room, so it didn't really fully answer my question. I sent a text to the owner asking about it, but I was already here and didn't have the time nor energy to make other arrangements. At that point, I was just hoping for a partial refund or something. After getting my bags into my room, I went into the kitchen to prepare some of the food I'd bought on the way up to the rental. Less than a minute went by before the woman came out again and met me in the kitchen. It wasn't until now that I'd taken a better look at her though. She was older, I'd say mid-40s, with tired eyes and messy hair. It looked like she'd either just woken up or had been awake for too long. She started up another conversation, asking me about myself and telling me about her, and it became obvious now that she was definitely flirting with me. I was only in my early 20s, so this was pretty weird and not something I was into. I didn't want to be rude, especially if we'd be staying here together, but I also got increasingly more weirded out as the conversation progressed. She started smiling more and asked if I wanted to see her room, being really pushy about it, even though I insisted on just eating my food and going to bed. As I continued to deny though, her smile slowly diminished into a frown, getting upset at my lack of interest. Just as things were getting creepy, my phone buzzed on the counter. I looked at it, and my stomach tightened. The owner sent me a text saying nobody else should be there and to call the police if there was anyone inside. I looked back at the woman, who still had a distasteful look, and then I heard a door open from down the hallway, followed by heavy footsteps charging through the house. I left everything and sprinted for the door, seeing a man in the corner of my eye running toward me as I left the house and ran for my car. getting out of there as fast as I could. By the time authorities arrived, the man and woman were nowhere around. What they would have done had I followed the woman into the room is unknown. Thankfully, my belongings I'd left behind were still there, but that only concerns me more about what their intentions were.